Synchronous Conferences. Depending on your situation, synchronous conferences with students may be a smaller or larger part of your work as an online instructor. If you work in a writing center or other online tutoring setting, one-on-one real-time conferences may be a big part of your day. If you teach technical writing or advanced comp, you may meet one-on-one with students only occasionally. Whether you use synchronous conferencing frequently or not, the principles and skills involved are essential for any online instructor. Now, conferencing is one of the 5 types of feedback and assessment that we're going to be talking about in this course. So let's take a minute to review some key terms. These are also available to you in the major project description file, but I want to take just a moment to go over them. So you can see here conferencing is one of these 5 key things that we're talking about in this course when we talk about feedback and assessment. So let's just go through these quickly. The first one is formative feedback. Formative feedback is feedback given through either synchronous video conferencing or writing that helps the student to draft, shape, and revise a text. Formative feedback is what we will be focusing on the most. It's feedback that is obviously formative in the sense that it is designed to promote the formation of ideas and revision strategies. Summative feedback is different. Summative feedback is given at the end of an assignment, generally on a final draft, and it summarizes, as the name suggests, right? Summative summarizes the work that a student has completed and helps a student transfer the skills they have learned in that assignment, ideally, to future work. So formative in process, summative at the end. Then we have the word assessment, which means generally evaluating a student's work, i.e. giving a grade. Right? Assessment is often paired with both formative and summative feedback, but can be separate from feedback as well. And I think many people conflate assessment with feedback. They assume that all feedback is evaluative in nature and that all feedback to a student involves grading, and that is not necessarily true. In fact, I find it most useful to save the evaluative part till the end, personally myself. I like to focus on the formative feedback, helping the students develop their ideas, take it the next step and the next step and the next step. And then we talk about, the score and the grade only near the end of the process. So assessment and that evaluation is only one piece of this larger pie. And then conferencing is what we're talking about here, right? When an instructor and a student or a tutor and a student meet one-on-one for individual instruction in writing. Conferencing can happen in a writing or learning center, peer tutoring, or in an online writing course in an instructor-to-student tutoring, which is what we are practicing in week 2. And then the final form of feedback and assessment is peer review, peer-to-peer conferencing, generally within the online writing classroom. So those 5 things are the primary focus of this course: formative feedback, summative feedback, assessment, and conferencing. They're not mutually exclusive. They overlap, right? You could use a conference to do formative feedback. You could use a conference to do summative feedback. You could do peer review framed as formative feedback. So it's not like you pick one. They definitely overlap, but these are important terms and very important definitions. So that gives you some context. So let's talk a little bit more about conferencing. And here's where Beth Hewitt comes in. This is from her introduction. And what Beth argues is that really our field lacks a good way to talk about conferencing. And I think she's right. She argues the following. These are 2 quotes from the first couple pages of the introduction to her book called The Online Writing Conference. She says the one-to-one online conference between writing instructor and student, typically developed as a written feedback to a draft or as a text-based lesson about writing, but sometimes provided using audiovisual technology, tends to be ignored or taken for granted. And in the second point there, the one-to-one nature of most instructor-based writing pedagogy is not often discussed. And the silence suggests that one-to-one teaching does not occur online, that one-to-one online pedagogy is transparent, or that one-to-one interactions are not considered teaching at all. So her book begins by mapping out this kind of problem, this lack, this gap that our field lacks a good way to talk about conferencing. She decided it was important enough to write a whole darn book about, and we're going to talk in quite a bit more detail about some of her ideas as we move forward, particularly later in week 2 when we do some reflection on our conferencing. We're going to use some of the terms and concepts from Hewitt's book to talk about and to assess ourselves and to reflect on our practice. But for now, this is the problem that she identifies, is that we really kind of take this stuff for granted, and we don't pay attention to it, we don't theorize it, we don't develop principles, we don't develop best practices, guess what? That's what we're about to do. So the first place I want to refer you to is this document called Effective Practices for Synchronous Online Teaching Interactions and Tutorials. It's linked to the course schedule. And it basically is a tip sheet for effective practices for synchronous online teaching and interaction in online tutorials. So I strongly encourage you to read through this while you're working on your conferences with your peer students this week, and then later this week when you reflect on the nature of those conferences and how you might want to do things differently or better next time. I'm not going to read through all of this. It's basically a step-by-step guide. Greet the student. Chat involves turn taking. Talk respectfully. So some of this is more about the communication ethics and the communication etiquette of the teacher-student conference. It's all very important material. But what I want to draw your attention to in particular are a couple really great suggestions. Number one is where she says right here, find out the context of the student's questions. And here she suggests that you get your student to talk first. Ask them, why are you here? What do you hope to accomplish in this session today? How can I help you? And as it says at the end of this bullet point right here, teaching assignments sometimes are woefully unclear. So be prepared to explain and then revisit and revise the assignment. That's exactly what we're going to be doing in the class. Based on the feedback that you get from your student, you're going to actually revise the assignment so that it is not, hopefully, so woefully unclear. But that's a good, the good idea is to let the student kind of take the lead a little bit at the beginning, find out what questions they have, let them talk. And then here I think is the most critical part of all of this, and something that we're going to talk about a lot when we get into her readings and using them to reflect on our own conferences. She says this, have an interaction strategy that engages instruction. Your goal is to help the student move the writing or the thinking about the writing to the next level. When finished, this interaction should provide encouragement, but also concrete guidance on what to do next. The student and you will work together to make the interaction fruitful. And she has some specific subpoints for how to do that. But I want to say here, in my own experience, the hardest thing for me to do in these online conferences is not to do the thinking for the student. I can obviously see things that student can't see. I have decades of experience writing and revising. I could basically revise the paper for them and say, watch this. And I'm sure they would love that, but they wouldn't learn how to do it themselves. So as an instructor, I have to really rein myself in and teach, but not do the thinking for them. And so I love the way she phrases it there. Help the student move the writing or the thinking about the writing to the next level. Have an interaction strategy that engages instruction. And she has some bullet points about specifically how to do that. And first of all, she says, use a strategy for addressing the most important before the least important. HOC, meaning higher order concerns, before LOC, lower order concerns. Don't spend a lot of time correcting grammar and style in a conference like this. You can do that later at the end of the process. You want to address the big picture, HOCs. I just think of that as big picture. Address the big picture. Work with fluency first, which includes brainstorming and thesis development as well as idea development, then form, meaning organization of paragraphs and information within paragraphs, and then correctness and issues of style. And I would say, for the most part, I really would not even worry about correctness and issues of style in a face-to-face conference. I would really focus on, again, the brainstorming, thesis development, and idea development. Get the student to talk. What are you trying to say here? What are you really getting at? How are you going to accomplish this assignment? What are some other ways you might think about it? Keep asking your student those big questions and help them develop their thesis and develop their ideas. Teach, don't talk. Again, some really good strategies here. Know what you're talking about, be flexible, and so on. Again, some good advice here for general practices about how to do these online conferences. Close with a brief wrap-up and a set of next steps. That's always a good reminder. Do you know? Let's summarize what we went over today. Make the students summarize for you. Again, don't do their thinking for them. Tell them how you're going to follow up. Invite the student to return to a follow-up meeting and so forth. So again, this is the document called Effective Practices for Synchronous Online Teaching by Beth Hewitt that is really a kind of greatest hits of nuts and bolts of how to run an effective online conference. So that's the best place to start, and then we'll move into some of her chapters in a little bit little bit later as we move into reflecting and learning from some of these practices. So then what happens? What are we going to do after we do these conferences? Well, let me just go back to, this is the major project description. There's this chart again, and I think it's a really good roadmap for what we're doing in the course. I know I refer to it all the time to help remind myself of the context. So we are right here in week 2. Conduct a video conference with your student to help them begin the assignment and post the video recording to the Blackboard discussion board. That's your primary project for now. As the student, your primary job is to participate in the video conference, and then all of us will be analyzing and reflecting on the conferences of each other on the discussion board. We'll get to watch your videos and give you constructive feedback on what you might do differently or different or better the next time. So that's week 2. Then what happens? Well, in week 3, you are going to go off as the student based on what you learned in your conference and actually complete the first draft of the assignment. So you are actually playing undergraduate writing student, completing your instructor's assignment, and all of us will be continuing to provide feedback to the instructor about the assignment and to participate in the video conference analysis. So that's ongoing in week 3. In week 4, you shift gears. You're not really doing anything as a student. You're moving back to the instructor role. Week 4, provide formative feedback. Remember that term? Provide formative feedback on the student's assignment. And then we will finish the video conference analysis and discussion over here. Then in week 5, initiate a text chat conference about the feedback on the student's draft. So now you're giving feedback on what the student did in week 3. Complete a text chat conference around your draft in Google Docs. So now we're deep into formative feedback and revising, and then analyze the chat conferences of other grad students in the discussion board. Week 6, you will revise, again, back in the role of student. You're going to revise this assignment and submit your final draft. So as a student, your work is pretty much done when you complete this revised draft in week 6. In the discussion forums, then we will finish the chat analysis and discussion. And then in week 7, you will provide the final summative assessment to your student who has completed your project up here in week 6. And then you will revise your final assignment to submit it for the final portfolio for the course. So we're doing kind of a 2-cycle pass through this project of student, teacher, student, teacher. You will get to see the formative assessment and the summative assessment from both sides, from the student side and from the instructor side. And as an instructor, you will take that feedback and revise the original assignment and reflect on what you learned as a result of this whole process. So I think it's kind of a neat model. It's very workshop-y, very hands-on. And over here in this peer-to-peer column on the discussion forum, that's where we're going to be bringing in the theory and talking about what worked and what didn't work. And let's look at, why is that? Does Beth Hewitt help us to understand why this works better than that? And is there some strategies that we might use to do it differently next time? So the discussion board is really where we connect the readings and the theory to the practice and reflect on that, what we've learned as a result. So that's sort of a roadmap of where we're going after week 2, once we complete these initial video conferences to get your students going on their projects. Okay, so that's what we're doing. That's synchronous conferencing. Thanks for listening.